Closing her amber eyes briefly, Clementine focused on spreading the walker's insides all over herself and Sarah, making sure to cover every last bit of the live human beings with the stench of death. The older girl was trembling as Clementine soothed the blood all over her, complaining in a husband voice of how disgusting act it was. This whole situation just brought back painful memories of Lee in general. Sarah exactly acting like Clementine when they escaped from the stranger's house was not helping anything. It took Clementine had to swallow the lump in the building in her throat. She needed to be strong for him. "Shh, I need you to be quiet, Sarah," she murmured, wiping her hands on her pants once she was finished. "I promise this will keep you safe." The method that had worked before like a charm, and this was a promise Clementine intended to keep. Sarah was her friend, and no one in her group would be abandoned. Carlos was nearby, repeating the same words to his daughter reassuringly as he could. Clementine gave a nod to him, entrusting him to know what to do to keep Sarah safe as they prepared to walk through the horde. "We ain't getting all day here. Everybody ready?" Kenny asked, checking the group for anyone who was still smearing guts all over themselves. Thankfully, they all had done their job. With their appearance and stench, the group probably looked like a bunch of crazy people, but they would survive. Clementine's gaze then flashed onto Kenny's, and she nodded to him as well. He returned to the notion and nodded. "They're almost onto us." Before anyone could respond any further, a sound from behind them was a new voice. "What in the actual fuck is going on here?" Clementine stiffened at Troy's loud hiss. The wound on their cheek and even throbbed, and she remembered the guard smacking her for an attempt to help Kenny. As far as she was concerned, Troy was a horrible man. He would ruin everything if he got too loud in this situation. He babbled on more, demanding what their sick shit was. His rifle pointed to the group. Luke reached for his own weapon, but Troy caught him in the act and threatened to shoot him if he moved. Clementine bit her lip and gazed over the trailing of her friends. It was do or die. She didn't even know what to do. Without thinking, Clementine rushed at Troy, attempting to redirect the rifle. Once her hands had clapped around the weapon, she yanked it in the direction of the sky. A shot rang out, and the heat radiating from the burning in her ear. "Get off! The hell is your problem, you little—" Troy squawked in surprise as Clementine let go of the rifle. She backed up and watched the color drain from his face. Her eyes followed to this walker horde behind them, her own heart sinking in her chest. "Shit! Clem, you okay?" Luke cried out. "Get the hell away from her, asshole!" He then growled to Troy, giving him a violent shove back. Dazed, the guard staggered, only to charge forward into the walkers with his gun, firing freely a moment later. Well, that wasn't a smart move. Clementine then watched him disappear into the mess of the rotting flesh, wondering how long he could survive without reeking of death. She then turned back to Luke and the rest of the group, watching them ready themselves to walk to the horde. "We need to go," she whispered to Luke, receiving a nod in response. It became evident that the lurker horde had become agitated by Troy's shot, and what if they didn't move now? They wouldn't make it. Nick joined his friends moments later, and Clementine found Sarah, trying to murmur words of encouragement to her naive companion. Jane, with their mysterious new ally, was softly giving instructions to the group. "Don't make any noise," she advised, tracking her eyes about the crowd. "And for fuck's sake, walk. Act like you belong, and you will belong." Clementine remembered Lee mentioning something like that. By acting like a walker and smelling like one, the Fiends couldn't tell the difference. It wasn't a perfect method of safety, and she couldn't possibly trust Jane fully yet. But from her own experience, this seemed to be a smart way to escape, and their only option to boot. Tavia and the other guards were shooting from the rooftop, yelling out demands for more ammo and asking where Carver was. Clementine fought back the urge to cover her head, as she didn't want to risk being spotted by the walkers, but being shot by Carver's followers wasn't a pleasant thought either. She tried not to think about it, and focused on where she was going, and on how much further there was to walk. Her group's quiet words of encouragement did help as well. She kept as calm as she could, taking cautious but full steps, keeping a moving eye on Sarah in front of her. Carlos was leading the girls, and his facial expression spelling out more worry and fear more than ever. However, it was understandable. Sarah wasn't doing well, as she was shaking again and her breath was quickening. Preluding to the panic, she then showed when the things went to shit. Her father instructed Clementine to say something, and just as she was brainstorming words to Sarah, a stray bullet went through Carlos's neck. He fell to his knees instantly, walkers latching onto him with their teeth. Clementine watched in horror, suddenly reminded those that she had lost walkers to bite marks in the past. Sean, Doug, Duck, Pete, and Lee. Oh God, Lee! No, this wasn't the time. Her wrenched those thoughts out of her mind and turned away from the sight of Carlos. What was she thinking? This was not the time to dwell on the past, and Sarah needed her help now. The girls were screaming her heart out, alerting the walkers to their statuses of prey. Her nails dug into the sides of her head. Her despair poured out all at once, and Clementine feared that she would sink into the knees at that moment. The monsters around them were closing in, being picked off by Bonnie and Sarita as best as they could manage. "Run, Sarah!" Clementine cried out without thinking. The teen girl sprinted off into the horde blindly, still yelling in panic and grief. Clementine attempted to follow, but more walkers blocked her path, raising her cleaver. Clementine dove the blade into one's skull with a strong strike, and managed to snake out another grasp before it could claw at her. A weapon dug into more monster skulls before hearing a low scream nearby. As she hurried towards the noise, time seemed to be close to a halt. Clementine's breath caught in her throat as she stared at a certain man struggling with Lone Walker, his gun clicking uselessly as he attempted to fire the bullets that were not there. The creature's teeth were sunken deep into his wrist as he tried to wrench himself from its grasp. Clementine slowed down and raised her weapon, unsure of what to do, knowing she didn't have much time to think, though. This was Troy, the man who stood by and watched Kenny get beaten. He would have smacked Sarah and smacked Clementine herself without mercy. He threatened the group like shit, asserting his authority as Carver's right-hand man, parading himself around prison like a slave driver. Clementine was fully aware of how horrible it was. She almost set down the cleaver down and turned around to go find Sarah, to aid someone who deserved actually her help. But when she saw Troy's fearful gaze, he then noticed his eyes were pleading with hers silently. He tried to escape and he knew he was as good as dead, but that bothered her. She couldn't place her finger on why. Just for a split second, she wondered what Lee would have done in this situation. He would have saved an enemy, or at least spared him from being eaten alive. He'd taken mercy on those men back at the dairy farm, hadn't he? He'd showed who she was watching, knew it was a tough decision to make, but it was ultimately for her sake. It wasn't something she understood then, but this is the moment there. It connected with her all too quickly. She had to do this, if not to become the monster like Troy or Carver. Carver claimed that she was just like him, that she already seen so many horrific things that affect her in a way that she couldn't see, although she instantly denied it. His words still bothered her more than she was willing to admit it. She had no desire to end up humane as Carver. He said that she had the same look in her eyes as him. Well, she'd prove him wrong right then and there now. Her eyes would not see the death of Troy, her enemy, so long as she could help it. Her weapons raised over her head, she made a decision that would prove her actions different from William Carver's. The blade sliced into Troy's flesh sloppily with a squishing sound. She stared over at the child. He stared wide-eyed in disbelief as a sudden pain surely coursing through his body. Clementine didn't say a word as she released her weapon, giving one last glance around before plunging the cleaver right through his arm, hacking the limb off and surrendering it to the walker. Troy clutched his upper arm, his eyes bulging out at Clementine's and back to his dismembered limb a few more times before letting out a blood-curdling scream. She couldn't blame him. It looked terrible, a mess of blood, meat, and bone exposed to the world. Clementine winced at the sound, noticing chunks of his flesh dripping before she had to tear her gaze away to meet Troy's. Not unexpectedly, he was absolutely horrified, his expression showing a frown of raw fear and agony that Clementine had seen before. More times than she should have. For a moment after seeing his eyes quickly blink and his body wobbled a little, she feared that he would faint right there on the spot. If that were the case, then chopping his arm off would have been pointless. But he's good as dead. But she still held up her arms as if swailing, and if she could somehow catch him and drag him to safety, that delusion, thankfully, it wasn't put to the test, as he seemed to gain at least some sense and gave her a shaky nod. A stray walker approached the two of them. Clementine once more raised her weapon and sliced it into his skull, watching it fall to the ground as quickly as she could manage. She cut a small crevice out of the corpse, reattracting some of its guts to smear around Troy's torso. She oddly in charge of him now, after saving his life, grabbing his remaining arm, and she hissed in the low, "Get behind me!" and kept her steady pace throughout the horde. She only managed to kill a few more walkers before they began to overwhelm the two of them. Before all hope was lost, however, a few bullets fly into the skulls of the approaching walkers. Whatever those rifles were, friends or foes, Clementine didn't even know, nor did she particularly care. "Come on," she muttered to Troy, watching him stumble silently behind her. It wasn't much further. Finally, towards the outer edges of the mass, Clementine spotted Sarah. The girl was curled up on the ground. Bonnie stood nearby, shooting any beast that got too close. Clementine yelled out for their names, knowing not to keep quiet when she wasn't going to hinder the situation further. The red-headed turned to see Clementine approaching, shooting the two more lurkers that were behind them. "Troy, you made it, though?" She was asked, almost bewildered at the survival of her own co-worker. Before the injured man could respond, Kenny's strong voice rang out from the walker's hungry growls. He shot a few monsters before backing up into Bonnie, turning around and nearly blowing her head off in the process. Whoa, chill the fuck out, Kenny," Nick hissed, appearing with Luke and Rebecca seconds later. Mike and Jane trailed behind, both with cold expressions on their faces, once they spotted Troy. "Sorry, I still haven't had trouble shooting with one eye," the older man replied, shaking his head and lowering his weapon. A lot of them were just outside of the horde, and which seems to be focusing on Tavia's group atop of the roof, and blaring announcements regarding House Hardware's newest sale on the barbecue equipment. "It's fine, I'm not hurt," Bonnie insisted, turning to gaze to Troy. "But he's..." Kenny's eyes widened once more, and he noticed the man. His lips then curled into a snarl as he sauntered forward and grabbed Troy's collar, yanking him closer. You son of a bitch! How frickin' dare you show your face around here!" Troy's eyes widened as he tried to squirm out of Kenny's grasp, blabbering out, Whoa, Sarita placed a hand on her boyfriend's shoulder before he could do anything drastic. "Kenny, please calm down. The man is missing an arm." "I don't care if he's got 1, 2, or 10 arms, Sarita," Kenny roared. "He's an evil fucker that deserves to be put down right here and now." Clementine stepped forward, her voice as clear and confident as she could manage. As she mature, she could seem for an 11-year-old. "I'm the one who cut off his arm," she declared, her eyes narrowing at Troy, her light brown gaze shot to Kenny, giving him a fierce look. "He was bitten, and I did it so he could survive. There had been no choice. She was taught it was all about survival, after all." With a side of dish compassion. Without warning, Troy started to babble further. That's right. She did. I don't know why it happened, but it did, and shit, it still hurts. His words, of course, didn't make much sense, but it was obvious that he had lost a lot of blood already. Before anybody could respond to that mess of slurred words, Troy's legs gave out, making him collapse to the ground on dead weight. Clementine didn't jump, but her gaze softened a bit as Sarita bent down and checked the man's pulse. "He's lost a lot of blood, but he's passed out for now," she reported. The group exchanged glances at her before Clementine took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I don't want me chopping off his arm to be for nothing. I'm sorry I have to ask this, but..." Her voice trailed off, growing quiet as she looked at the rest of her friends. "You want to take him with us?" Luke guessed, crossing his arms. I don't know, Clem. "I know it's not smart, but..." Clementine fought back to Lee, allowing Lily back on the RV. even after she murdered Carly. It had been difficult for Lee, but everyone had accepted the decision. Lowering her gaze, she murmured, "I just couldn't leave him like that." To leave Troy to die now, after they've walked through the walkers, she'd wasted time and effort into saving him, just didn't sit right with her. "Can we get to a safe place?" Sarita asked, breaking Clementine out of her thoughts. "I think we should honor Clementine's choice. It was a decision lightly, I imagine." "You could say that again," Clementine sighed. The group murmured their passive agreement or disagreement to choice, but everyone was, or at least somewhat okay with bringing Troy along. Their focus shifted, however, once Rebecca noticed someone was missing. "Wait a minute, where's Carlos?" she asked, not realizing Sarah was nearby, shaking and sobbing in a mess. It only took a glance at the broken girl to understand immediately what had happened. Clementine then bit her lip, approaching her friend cautiously. "Sarah?" she murmured, bending down to the other girl's level on the ground. "Sarah, I'm sorry. We need to move," she insisted, holding her hands to Sarah. "Come on." Sarah seemed to be drained of life. Her eyes emptied and her mouth hung agape as the aftermath of the shock. She merely nodded weakly, bloodshot eyes avoiding Clementine's gaze and standing up, fixing her sights on the ground again. "Oh, sweetheart," Rebecca whispered sympathetically, but no one moved. "All right, then everything is settled for now," Kenny began, pointing his gun towards the dead building behind them. "That's our next stop, till we find that Civil War museum, leaving no room for arguments," he said. "Come on, let's get a move on." He paused and nodded, walking towards the bleeding, unconscious form of Troy on the ground. "Nick, grab the asshole." "I thought I was the asshole," Nick quipped sarcastically, quirking a brow at Kenny. "Well, it looks like your position's taken." Nick merely rolled his eyes and bent down to pick up to lift Troy, receiving a groan of pain from the injured man in response. "Shit, sorry," he murmured apologetically. "Here, I'll help." Luke chimed in, taking some of Troy's weight, and make him as comfortable as he could while he was supported between two of them. Luke flashed a smile at Clementine before beginning to walk forward with Nick. The girl smiled back, pleased with how the group was handling her decision. It really made her feel mature, and she had to decide to save a life, to be like Carver and let someone else weak die. Of course, there was still a problem whenever she severed Troy's arm quick enough, but given Reggie's experience, it didn't seem like it would be a big threat. After all, the amputation was nearly instantly after the bite. From what Clementine could tell, Kenny's pointed destination seemed like more of a pieces of a strip mall, broken into several stores like Carver's community had been. "Let's move," the one-eyed man said, leading everyone towards the building. "Given our new baggie, I'd say our first stop would be at the strip's pharmacy." Oh, the irony, but Clementine didn't even think about the last time she'd been to a pharmacy, as long as she was with her friends, and that one man who she saved, he wasn't her friend. Instead, she focused on holding Sarah's hand, giving comforting squeezes every so often. There was only so much she could do, though. Loss was the inevitable. In a world like this, even when you give out all your fight to save as many lives as possible,